Okay, guys, this is Mr. Cannon again, and today we're going to be talking about westward expansion of the United States. And in the last lesson, we looked at the first political parties and we looked at the John Marshall Court. Well, today we're going to be looking at expansion and the growing divide between the North and the South. And these two things are really connected, and it might not make sense to begin with, but I hope that I can show you how us expanding west actually made differences worse between the North and the South, if that makes any sense. So let's get started here, and we'll start by talking about the concept of manifest destiny. You can see the political cartoon down there on the bottom. Basically, manifest destiny is the idea that God had blessed westward expansion of the United States, that God wanted the United States to grow from a land that was continental in nature, that it was a nation from ocean to ocean, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that was a God-ordained thing. And you can see there the angel basically going with the settlers out west. Now, if Americans believe this, and they did, and many politicians believe this, if you believe that God wants you to have something, then of course nothing is going to get in your way of getting that thing you believe God wants you to have. So manifest destiny actually is going to cause the United States to act in certain ways, including going to war with Mexico, which we'll look at in a minute. On the map at the top, you can see how America expanded over the decades in the 1800s. We went from a nation just in the light green, well, you can see the original 13 colonies, and then after the Revolution in the light green there to the Mississippi River. Then we gained Florida to our south, and before you know it, we are a nation that goes west with the Louisiana Purchase, the Mexican Cession, Oregon Country, and we're going to look at all of those in a little more detail. But you need to understand this concept of manifest destiny to understand why America was so devoted to moving west, because they believed that God wanted America to move west, that it was God's will. All right, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, the first major land acquisition we want to look at is the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the Louisiana Purchase, you can see there, it's in the dark tan area. It is going to double the size of the United States. Now, Louisiana, the territory, was owned by the French, and it's going to be Thomas Jefferson as president who's going to purchase this from the French, actually from Napoleon Bonaparte. Jefferson is the third president of the United States. We have Washington and then Adams, John Adams, and now Thomas Jefferson. The unique thing about this purchase is that Jefferson, as a strict constructionist, remember he was a Democratic Republican who believed in strict construction of the Constitution, meaning if the Constitution didn't specifically say you could do it, then Jefferson believed you couldn't do it. So as a strict constructionist, that nowhere in the Constitution did it say a president could purchase land. So in actuality, under his views, he shouldn't have purchased this land. But as is the case with many politicians, he became a hypocrite and just did what went against his own beliefs and purchased it anyway. Now, it was a good thing that he did, because we buy this land for $15 million and we end up getting a steal out of it. Jefferson didn't fully realize what was out there in Louisiana. It turns out there was a lot. But what he did know is that the port city of New Orleans, down there at the tip of Louisiana, that was the mouth of the Mississippi, and that alone was worth purchasing this land, because what the Port of New Orleans does is it gives us control of the Mississippi River and access to the Gulf of Mexico, where then we can trade all over the world and then send ships up and down the Mississippi River to send our supplies out west. It really is a great acquisition by us. Now, Jefferson is going to send Lewis and Clark, the explorers, out to Louisiana. Even before he purchased this, he's going to go ahead and plan an expedition out into Louisiana and then further to the Pacific Ocean. And Lewis and Clark are going to go on this journey, and they're going to find all kinds of things. And what we really find is that Louisiana is full of natural resources. And in fact, even today, the area that was part of this Louisiana Purchase, it's the Midwest, and a lot of those states out there today produce the majority of our food, especially when it comes to things like wheat, beef from cows. The majority of our cows, the majority of our wheat is grown and raised out there in these areas that were part of Louisiana Purchase. So this is by itself, that was enough to purchase this land, and it ended up being a really good acquisition by us. Now, two problems are going to emerge with the purchase of Louisiana. The first is Native American groups that are out there. Some of them have already been pushed off their land from the east. Some of them have not really come in contact with very many white settlers before. But they do after we buy Louisiana and send more and more people out west to settle there. Now, this is going to take decades, guys, but over the decades, we're going to see more and more Native Americans being pushed further, getting in conflicts with Americans, and fights are going to result. And it never turns out well for the Native American groups. They always, either through treaty or through war, lose their land. And so that's one of the issues. A second issue with Louisiana that wasn't a positive one were new debates that emerged over the issue of slavery. What we're going to find, guys, is that slavery, for every new piece of ground that we gain as we move out west, the first question that comes up is this new land going to be free territory or slave territory? And in reality, this was all about power. Because if the land is free territory, that means the northern states are going to gain more power in the Congress as those areas gain senators and representatives. If the area is slave territory, then the southern states gain more power in the Congress. And so there are going to be huge fights over these tracts of land over whether they're going to be free or slave. And when we get into the causes of the Civil War, we're going to find that a lot of the causes of the Civil War are going to come from the purchase and the acquisition of these pieces of land. Okay. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is the age of Jackson. All right, Andrew Jackson, as president, is going to usher in a new era of democracy in America. Now, this is not a democracy for everyone yet. That's not going to happen until the civil rights movement. But what we do see is more white men gain the right to vote and hold office during the age of Jackson. Jackson, as president, he was considered a man of the people, sort of a common man. He was the first president that came from the West. He was actually born in South Carolina, raised in Tennessee, but Tennessee was considered the West back then. And so as a Westerner, he was viewed as a man of the people. And as a man of the people, he's going to usher in a time where poorer white men are going to get that right to vote. The land requirements to hold office and to vote are going to be taken away in a lot of cases under the age of Jackson. And so we call this the Jacksonian democracy. And in return for that, Jackson's going to help build a constituency, a group of people. That's what a constituency is. It's a group of people who are going to vote for him and his party because he supports them. And that party, of course, is going to be the Democratic Party. Andrew Jackson really builds up the Democratic Party. Now, the age of Jackson and the Jacksonian democracy, where more people have the right to vote, is going to be one of the positive aspects of Andrew Jackson's presidency. There are going to be a lot of negative aspects to that presidency as well. The most negative is probably the third bullet there, and that's the Indian Removal Act. Andrew Jackson, in his upbringing, had some bad experiences with Native Americans, and so when he joined the military, he became a Native American fighter down in Florida, the Seminole tribe especially. Jackson was one of the military leaders down there who was fighting the Seminoles as we're trying to take over down in Florida. And so he's going to have a lot of experiences with Native Americans that are not positive. As a result, when he becomes president, his views are really, if Native Americans are in the way of the United States expanding, then it's not a deal that needs to be worked out between the two sides. It's Native Americans need to get out of the way. And that's really what Indian removal is all about. This specific Indian Removal Act involved the Cherokee tribe. Cherokee tribe was the largest tribe in the East, and we're talking mainly in northern Georgia, where you had a conflict between the United States and this tribe. the Cherokee, instead of going to war as many tribes did, and as they had done in the past, in this time period, the Cherokee are going to actually take the government basically in its own battlefield, which is the law. The Cherokee are actually going to sue the government, arguing that it is not legal for them to be removed from their land. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and in Worcester versus Georgia, that was the name of the case, the Supreme Court sided with the Native American tribe. They sided with the Cherokee. Now, unfortunately, Andrew Jackson, because he was such a strong president and also someone who didn't really care what the Supreme Court said, he made the famous statement that John Marshall, the Chief Justice, has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. In other words, he didn't care that the Supreme Court ruled the Indian Removal Act was illegal. He was still planning on removing those Native Americans. And in fact, they were removed after he left the presidency, when his vice president, Martin Van Buren, continued this policy of Indian removal. And that is called the Trail of Tears. This removal of the Cherokee tribe from northern Georgia and on an 800-mile trek out to what is present-day Oklahoma is called the Trail of Tears because it was so brutal. It was a forced march. In other words, they weren't allowed to go at their own pace. They were forced by the military to march so many miles in a day. And as you can see there in the image of the Trail of Tears, you see the military is actually the ones sort of driving this march. The conditions were brutal. There wasn't enough food for the Native Americans. It was very cold, and not all of them had the proper equipment. And as a result, you're going to see not a thousand, but you're going to see a quarter, 1/4 of those Native Americans die. So a quarter of all the Native Americans who make the journey died on the journey. That's why it's called the Trail of Tears, and it is a black eye in American history. It is a bad mark on our record. We have a lot of bad marks, but that is one of the bad marks. And so Jackson is going to be sort of known for Indian removal, and this is one of the very negative parts of his presidency. So if the Jacksonian democracy is positive, the Indian Removal Act is negative. Neither positive nor negative, but a threat to the country is going to occur while Jackson is president in the 1820s, and it's called the nullification crisis. Now, this all actually boils down to South Carolina. South Carolina really despised a federal law called the tariff. And actually, South Carolina called it the tariff of abominations. They said it's so bad, it's an abomination. And what a tariff is, it's a tax on imported goods. Now, if you know America back in this time period, you have the South being primarily agricultural, and the North during this time period is becoming more industrial. And so those northern manufacturers desperately want Americans to buy American-made products. So one of the things the government does to encourage that is they put a tax on imports. So just to give you an example, this isn't exactly how it worked, but this is one way it could work. Let's say that you had shoes made in England. And so Americans were buying these English shoes because English shoes were cheaper than American shoes. They could make them cheaper in England. Well, what the tariff did is it put a tax on those English shoes so that when they came into America, they cost more than the American-made shoes do. They wouldn't without the tax, but they do with the tax. And so now Americans are forced to buy American shoes. Northern manufacturers, people making shoes in America, are happy with the tariff. But if you're not a manufacturer, and if you're in an area like the South that doesn't have manufacturing, you don't like the tariff. To make matters worse for the South, in return, England and France would then put a tariff on our major export to them. And of course, we only had one big export that we sent to Europe, and that was, of course, cotton. So by putting a tariff on our cotton to try to pay us back, it hurt farmers in the South, specifically plantation owners. And so in South Carolina specifically, the government flipped out over this tariff and came up with this idea called nullification. Actually, it wasn't their idea, but it was an idea they took from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that we covered in the last lesson. Basically, what happened when Jefferson was going up against the Federalists is they passed these Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that said, if the government passes something that you view as unconstitutional, you don't have to obey it. You can nullify or get rid of the law. Well, South Carolina is going to take it a step further during this period, and they're going to say if we don't like a law, if we view a law as damaging to our interest, like the tariff was, then we don't have to obey that law. Well, of course, Andrew Jackson, as president, he's in charge of the federal government, and he says, no, South Carolina, you absolutely have to obey the law. His vice president, John Calhoun, happened to be from South Carolina. So his vice president actually resigned, said, I don't want to be vice president anymore, came back to South Carolina, became a senator, and fought Jackson on this issue. And it was a big standoff. Jackson threatened to send down the military. South Carolina didn't look like they were going to back down from this whole tariff issue. And we almost had a civil war right here in the 1820s over this tariff. Now, luckily, both sides did back down. Basically, the Congress lowered the tariff. They didn't get rid of it, but they lowered it. And then South Carolina said that they would give up the whole nullification issue. But what South Carolina did not say is that they were wrong in nullification. So basically, South Carolina held on to the idea that if they wanted to, they could nullify something. And that, of course, is going to be a problem just a few decades later. But in this particular case, South Carolina did back down, and the nullification crisis ended without conflict. Now, Jackson, at the end of his life, he said, they asked him, do you have any regrets in your life? He said, I have two. The first was that he didn't bet on this racehorse that won a lot of races. He said, I should have bet on him. The second was that he didn't hang John Calhoun from the highest tree when he had a chance. Now that tells you how bad the situation was, that one of Andrew Jackson's only regrets in life was that he didn't hang his own vice president. Okay, the next thing we want to look at is something called the Monroe Doctrine. All right, this happens when James Monroe is the president. We're sort of going back in time a little bit here, but this is going to really affect a lot of American foreign policy from here on the next 100 years. Basically, it was a document that warned Europe and European nations to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. You can see there on the political cartoon, you can see there it's telling the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Asia, and Africa, don't come over to the Western Hemisphere and America. This is our hemisphere. Now, the truth is, even though we wrote this document, we weren't powerful enough in the early 1800s to enforce it. But we did have an ally that wanted to enforce it for us, and that was the British military. The reason Britain wanted to enforce the Monroe Doctrine is because they were trading with South America. And their trade was going pretty well as long as they could keep Spain and France out of South America. So basically, Britain was fine with the United States controlling the Western Hemisphere as long as they got to keep their trade partners. So the British military, which was the most powerful military at the time, is going to actually enforce the Monroe Doctrine for us until we get, of course, big enough to enforce it ourselves. And then eventually, Teddy Roosevelt is going to expand on the Monroe Doctrine to say not only does Europe need to stay out of our hemisphere, but actually we as the United States can get involved anywhere in our hemisphere that we need to be involved. And of course, in Teddy Roosevelt's day, in the early 1900s, that's going to include an area called Panama, where we wanted to build a canal. We decided that that would be good for our own interests. And because we control this hemisphere, we said we can go down there and do it. Who cares what Panama thinks about it? We're going to do it. So that was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But the bottom line of the Monroe Doctrine is it tells the rest of the world, this is our hemisphere. This is my house, and you don't come in it, basically, is how we told the rest of the world. All right. Moving on from that. All right, the next thing we need to talk about is the Mexican War. So the next large amount of land that we're going to gain is going to come from a war with Mexico. Basically, it starts in Texas. All right, now this is a sort of a long story, and I'm going to try to shorten it as much as possible. But Texas is going to gain their independence from Mexico. So Mexico, who gained their independence from Spain, is going to control this area in blue on the map called Texas or Tejas. And Texas is going to gain their independence from Mexico. You might know that whole story. It's the story of the Alamo, where all those people, 189 people, are going to die in the Alamo, but the rest of Texas is going to say, remember the Alamo, and they're going to use it as a rallying cry to kick Mexico out of Texas. And as a result, Texas becomes an independent republic. Now, in the short term, Texas wanted to become part of the United States, but the United States wasn't ready to adopt Texas yet, and the reason was slavery. We were having our own fights over slavery between the North and the South. Texas was a slave area, so both sides knew if Texas becomes part of the United States, then it would give the slave states more power. So for the short term, right after Texas gained its independence, we did not annex Texas. Eventually, though, years later, we did. And when we annexed Texas, we had our eye on some other land out in the western part of America that Mexico controlled. So President Polk, James K. Polk, had the idea to send troops down to the border between Texas and Mexico. He basically is trying to instigate a fight. Polk wants that land, and he knows if he can get Mexico to attack us, he can get that land. That's exactly what happens. Mexico attacks the United States. They see that our troops being down there is an act of war. They attack us, and the result is the Mexican War, which we win relatively easily. And after we win the war, we're going to confiscate or cede or take that land in the pink. So not only do we gain Texas in the blue, but we also gain all that land in the pink out west. California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Arizona, New Mexico, part of Colorado. That's a large chunk of land, guys. And it's going to increase our power even more. It's also going to make us, as you can see there, a continental nation. Not only do we get land that way, but then you can see there in the beige at the top, the tan area, we also purchase or come up with a treaty with Britain to gain Oregon, the Oregon Territory up in the northwest. So at that point, we are a continental nation. Between the Mexican War and the Oregon Territory, we are a nation that stretches from ocean to ocean. Manifest destiny has been fulfilled, in other words, in Americans' eyes. This increase of land is going to lead to more problems, though. And those problems, of course, are going to come between the North and the South, especially in the Congress, where you're going to have a balance of power between free and slave states upset as more states enter the Union. And whoever gets more states, whether it be the free areas or the slave areas, is going to gain power, and whoever gains power is going to control the government. All right? And so let's look at this as a whole here. These territorial acquisitions, we can see there we started in the green. So that was the United States after the Revolution in 1800. We quickly are going to gain Florida from Spain in the pink down there. And then, of course, we get in 1803, Jefferson buys Louisiana. So that area doubles our size in the yellow. We gain Texas and Mexico. Basically, Mexico, the Mexican cession, excuse me, the areas out in the west, we gained through a war. Okay, and by the way, that war was not a war that we had to fight. It's a war we wanted to fight. Most of the wars that we fight in America are wars that we feel like we are justified in fighting because we have to, like World War II, where we're defeating the Nazis. In this particular case, this is a war we wanted to fight because we wanted that land. And then, of course, in the green at the top, left-hand corner, you can see the Oregon country, and that is the continental United States. I want you to truly understand, though, guys, that this land acquisition, the more land we gain, the more problems that rose up between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. And we're going to see this play out, guys, when we get to the causes of the Civil War. We're going to see that this land is going to be a huge part of why the Civil War actually takes place. It's the fights over land that are going to drive the conflict. And we'll talk more about that in the next unit. Until next time, see you later. Okay, the last thing we want to cover in this unit are the emerging differences between the North and the South during this period of American history. In the South, this period from 1800 to 1860 is called the antebellum period, and it was a period where the South's going to become more reliant on agriculture than before, and they were already reliant on agriculture. So the South sort of doubles down on becoming an agricultural economy, and in this particular period, the dominant crop by far in all of the South is cotton. Now, before this period in the 1700s, you had more diverse crops that made money for different plantation owners throughout the South. But during this period, in 1800 to 1860, the antebellum period, is going to be cotton. In fact, cotton is king was the saying in the South. Even small farmers grew cotton during this period. Now, most farmers in the South did not own slaves. Most farmers did not own plantations. That's where the majority of the slaves were in the South, were on these plantations. Most Southern farmers were smaller farmers. But it is going to be the plantation owners that own these hundreds and thousands of acres that are going to dominate society in every way. They dominate the economy, they dominate politics, they dominate the culture. And it is a slave economy. There is no doubt about that in the South. So even though the majority of Southerners don't own slaves, slavery is going to dominate the South because the plantations required slavery to make money. And that's why slavery during this period actually is going to start increasing. In the 1700s, slavery actually began decreasing in all parts of America, but in the South it began to decrease, and maybe it looked like it would even eventually die out. But it was the cotton gin that is going to cause slavery to increase even more. So in the 1800s, slavery actually is on the rise again in the South. Now in the North, the picture on the right there, as it becomes more industrial and becomes more reliant on manufacturing, slavery dies out in most of the North. Now, slavery was in both the North and the South at the founding of the country. So we need to understand that. If you had a misunderstanding of that, you need to correct that. Slavery was in all of America. It wasn't just in the South. But as time goes on, as the decades go on from the 1700s to the 1800s, most northern states began to get rid of slavery. And the main reason was, to be honest, is the economy of the North didn't rely on slavery. You know, slavery was very profitable on plantations, but you did not have a lot of plantations. You didn't have plantations at all in the North. And so the North didn't really benefit from a slave economy. And so as a result of that, because they weren't benefiting from a slave economy, slavery began to die out. Now, there was still some slavery in some northern states all the way into the 1830s, but the majority of those northern states began to ban slavery during this period. And there was an understanding by many people in both the North and the South that slavery was wrong. Even those who supported keeping it legal understood that slavery was wrong. Now, why would they support keeping it legal? Well, money is all about money, money, money. And just to let you know that it wasn't just the moral issue in the North that caused them to ban slavery. There were free African Americans in both the North and the South. And those free African Americans were not treated better in the North than they were in the South. Free African Americans, in fact, in the North were treated as second-class citizens. They weren't given full political rights. They couldn't make as much money as white counterparts. And so it wasn't like you had freedom in the North where everyone was treated equally and slavery in the South where everyone was a racist. It wasn't that way at all. This was more about the economy. The economy of the North did not rely on slave labor, so therefore slavery died out in the North. Now, the differences between these two regions are not only going to be economic in that the South is agricultural and the North becomes more industrial, but they're also cultural. The South, being an agricultural area, is much more laid back. It is more reliant on the seasons and the weather, where in the North it becomes more industrial and is more reliant on the clock. It's more reliant on, okay, we go to work at this time of day every day. We get off of work at this time of day every day. And it was a more fast-paced society as a result of that. Not only that, if you go back to the colonial period, remember the people that founded many of the northern states were Puritans. So you had this Puritan work ethic and Puritan values in the North that you didn't see as much in the South. The South was founded primarily to make money, and so the plantation owners are going to be all about making money. We're also going to see that one of the reasons you have more abolitionists in the North, more people who wanted to ban slavery in the North, is because of the Quaker influence. Remember, Quakers who founded Pennsylvania are going to be anti-slavery from the get-go, and so there are going to be more abolitionists in the North. There is no doubt about that. There were some abolitionists in the South, like the Grimke sisters from South Carolina. They eventually had to leave South Carolina because speaking out against slavery was a very dangerous thing for people in the South. But those they were white sisters from a plantation in South Carolina, actually ended up moving to the North. And these cultural differences are just going to get more and more vast as we move closer to the Civil War. It's important to understand these differences because it's the differences between the two regions that are going to make it difficult for them to communicate with one another. It's going to be difficult for them to understand one another. And of course, when conflicts emerge and you don't really understand each other or you don't really want to communicate with each other, it's hard to resolve those conflicts. And ultimately, we know we have a civil war between these two regions. And part of the reason for that civil war is simply because you had so big a difference between the two cultures of the North and the South that they could not communicate with each other. So we need to understand that when it comes time to talk about the Civil War in the next unit, that one of the issues that we see all these conflicts emerge between the two is simply because the two regions are different from each other. And of course, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, difference is the slave economy of the South versus the industrial economy of the North. And we'll talk more about that in the next unit.